A title card appears. Text, The Future of Work, afb.org/100. A logo, AFB 100, Inclusion Knows No Limits. And a photo montage with images of 5 people. Now, a woman in a home office speaks to us. Throughout this presentation, an American Sign Language interpreter appears in a box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen.
Welcome to the American Foundation for the Blind Centennial Conversation. My name is Katie Kelley. I am a Caucasian woman who identifies as she, her, with shoulder-length brown hair, based in Portland, Oregon. We are gathering today to learn from our panel experts about the current state of inclusion, intersectionality, and the future of work for people who are deafblind, or have low vision in the United States. According to the Global Accessibility Awareness Day website, from both a civil rights and a business perspective, people with disabilities, which encompasses 1 billion people, are underserved by today's digital products. Today, we will unpack through our panel of experts how the recent global pandemic and the United States reckoning with racial and societal injustices have impacted people with disabilities in the workplace. We will have time for questions at the 45-minute mark when the audience is invited to ask questions of our panelists. Please add those questions to the chat, and an AFB staffer will read those out for us. As a reminder, Alt-H or Command-Shift-H for Mac users is the shortcut to access the chat window. Note that this session is being recorded and will be made available in the AFB 100 archives at a later date. You can find all of our AFB 100 events at afb.org/100. We're so happy to have our ASL interpreters here, and the session has live captioning. The link for the captions is in the chat. Without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce our panel speakers today. Sarah Minkara, founder and CEO of Sarah Minkara LLC and board member of Empowerment Through Integration. Keri Gray, founder and CEO of the Keri Gray Group, DEI educator and consultant on race and disability. Jennison Asuncion, co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day and vice chair of the GAAD Foundation. And finally, Sachins Paritran, executive director of US Access Board. Welcome. So to begin our conversation today, I would like to quote an op-ed by AFB CEO Kirk Adams. This article was published last June. Quote, "The past few months of the pandemic have leveled the playing field for many workers with disabilities. And now we are at a crossroads. Organizations have the opportunity to rethink policies that may have erected unnecessary barriers for this enormous, motivated, yet overlooked talent pool. Can we take a leap forward in creating inclusive workplaces in the future?" Unquote. Again, this was published a year ago. So Sarah and Carrie, I'd love for you to join the conversation and help us understand what you are experiencing today for people with disabilities in the US in being able to access inclusive workplaces. Keri, why don't you jump in first?
Sure. Well, good afternoon to everyone, depending on what side of the world and the country that you're on. My name is Keri Gray. My pronouns are she, her. For a description, I'm a light-skinned Black woman who has these big old black glasses on, a mustard head wrap, and I'm wearing this white and black shirt. To get into your question, this is definitely a very, not just interesting time, but a fundamental time in our country right now. I think that, there's a lot that can be said about what we experienced this past year. We're still experiencing it. We're still processing it. But we ultimately know that we're kind of getting into the point of transitioning the workplace. Some of folks are considering, should we be back in the office? Should we stay remote? Should we be hybrid? And people are considering their policies and practices. And that definitely has to do with everything that we experience in the midst of a global pandemic. But one of the things that I want to bring into this space is that it also has to do with this sense of social justice, the atmosphere that is in the air right now around how are we building inclusive workplaces. As I mentioned earlier, I identify as a Black woman with disabilities. And what we're seeing about the future of accessibility in the workplace is that it has to be grounded in racial equity. So we're looking at the intersections of how are we ensuring that our workplaces are accessible for people with disabilities, for all types of folks that have been experiencing the impacts of the pandemic. But we also know that we were experiencing the historic uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that had our country and companies, organizations, everyone thinking about how are we treating people? How are we leaving space for folks to have this sense of belonging so that we can productively move forward collectively? So right now is a prime time and it's a real opportunity. Thankfully, some folks have been about this work, but it's a real opportunity for us to consider what are our priorities when it comes to constructing how we are building our workplaces, particularly since we are about to be in a season of transition, or we are currently in a season of transition. So it has us considering representation. It has us considering the physical infrastructure of our buildings. It has us considering transportation to and from work to a deeper extent, and all of the implications that are associated with work because you are a person with a disability who was also a person of color. The impacts of being a Black and brown person in the United States is significant. And now is a critical time for us to be wrestling with that reality and what changes need to occur so that we are genuinely gathering great talent, and we're producing outcomes that are inclusive of all of our people and all of our community. So I'll just open it up by stating, contextualizing that now is the season. Now is the time. We cannot ignore the fact that it's the prime opportunity for us to consider the implications of everything that has happened this past year. And a big piece of that is the intersectional practices of what we are developing that is inclusive of Black and brown people with disabilities. So thank you for that question.
Incredible. Keri, thank you so much. We knew you were the right person to set the table for this very broad, far-reaching conversation. So thank you so, so much. Sarah, would love to hear from you as well on, this just the large table setting of today's conversation. Thank you.
Definitely. And hello, everyone. And thank you so much for having me here. And my name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, hers, and her. I am wearing a Black blazer, Black and white striped shirt, a white headscarf with a Black underpiece, and I have a virtual background that has my company logo. So yes, the COVID, the pandemic has, really been an opportunity of pause and reflection when it comes to disability. For many, many generations and many years, people with disabilities have been asking for certain accommodations that now majority of people have because of the situation, right? Flexible work hours, flexible working from home, et cetera, et cetera. But it was never really part of the conversation because it was seen as an extra accommodation. The pandemic hit and it really made everyone rethink and restructure how they're looking at their work and beyond. But I think the pandemic has kind of really shed light on that there's still gaps of exclusion when it comes to people with disability, when it comes to the work setting. And it goes beyond just, the surface level of exclusion. There's a systemic level of exclusion and marginalization to people with disability that the narrative until now is at best a human rights narrative. People with disabilities, when it comes to the work setting, it's most of the time it's seen as a burden. When they're asking for accommodation, they're seen as an add-on to the system. At best, it's seen as a human rights aspect. This is the right thing to do. I think we really still need to get to a point where it's a value-based perspective. Employers, companies, systems saying, I want to include people with disabilities because they have value to bring forward. It's a benefit to all of us. The inclusion of all is a value for all. And I think if we never get to that point, we're still going to see points of exclusion and marginalization across the board. And we still see it. We still see it with how we are moving forward with solutions during and post-pandemic. A really great example is when Massachusetts brought forward the vaccination distribution in the beginning, where we were not doing a good job with even taking consideration people with disabilities and their kind of access to it, right? Again and again, people with disabilities are still kind of part of the add-on to the system. And I always talk about inclusion. It's not enough for people to be in the room. It's not enough for people to have a seat at the table. We really need to look at inclusion from a value perspective and authentic lens perspective. Is everyone able to really bring their full self forward? People with disabilities are not just disabled. They could be women. They have race. There's so many different identities that we embody, and with those different identities, we embody our own unique journey, experience and journey. And I think that in order for us to really start addressing this from the get-go, we need to have systems say, I want to include employees with disabilities. I see the value. And then from then on, not making assumptions of what they need or what their journey is actually understanding their journey, understanding what their experience is, whether it's doing that through journey mapping or other types of kind of tools and solutions. And then from there on, we start building out solutions that is inclusive of all. I think we just don't even think about disability. I was talking one time to this organization at Stanford, and they were coming up with, doing a hackathon during the pandemic to really come up with certain solutions. And I was like, are you thinking about the disability perspective? We're like, no. We're still at that point. So I think, again, we do it in a way that it's not extra. It's not, this is just the right thing to do. I think there's a value for everyone in doing so. So that's where I would kind of.
Incredible. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to move along to the next topic. So we bring Sachin and Jennison into the conversations, but if there's any follow-up questions from the audience about Keri and Sarah's comments, please start to populate them in the chat if you like. So Sachin, bringing you into the conversation, roughly 7 out of 10 blind Americans are not employed today. The reasons are often multi-layered, tending to stem largely from bias, misperceptions about accommodations, inaccessible workplaces, and lack of transportation. Sachin, you are preparing to relocate from Utah to Washington, D.C., to serve an incredibly prestigious role as the executive director of the U.S. Access Board. For those of you who are not familiar with this board, it's the leading source on accessible design in the nation and the world. It develops standards for buildings, sidewalks, transit vehicles, telecommunications equipment, medical diagnostic equipment, and information technology. So Sachin, as we begin to see part of the country, I'm slower on the West Coast than many of you out on the East Coast as far as the return to work and experimentation with hybrid work policies. What are you seeing as top priorities in the federal workplace for people who are blind or visually impaired, please? Welcome, Sachin.
Thank you, Kelly. My name is Sachins Paritran, and my pronouns are he, him, his, as an image description. I'm a dark-skinned male of Southeast Asian descent. I'm wearing a light blue button-up shirt in my home office with a blurred background. So the conversation around accessible workspace and the accessibility of technology and the role of federal government and all the different sectors is obviously a pretty big topic right now. At the U.S. Access Board, accessibility is something that we define when we set standards and when we will work on regulations. That's, without defining what accessibility is, we believe we can't move forward when we write standards. Now, the federal government is the largest employer out there. Now, there is not one set criteria or a way the federal government is going to play out. Every department and every agency within the department is going to have different approaches to this. But when the pandemic hit last year, we often joke among the community that the federal government is probably the slowest to adapt, but the reality was the federal government really adapted pretty quickly when it comes to how to telework and work remotely. Now, since the pandemic is hopefully coming to the end, the dialogue is shifted. What is the federal workspace going to look like in the future for everyone, not just for people with disabilities, but for everyone? With that said, often if you're looking for federal employment, your options are pretty limited because most federal employment exists in big cities, DC and the Virginia DMV being the pretty big federal space. And if you wanted other opportunities with the federal government was limited. And when you're disabled, it makes it even more difficult because accessibility, transportation, all the other barriers that we all know that exist makes it more complicated. But that conversation is shifting now in the federal government. Now, like I said earlier, this is going to be different within each department, but the communication has changed. Also, personal management and other entities who have engaged all the departments and agencies have really brought into really embracing what remote work looks like, what telework looks like, what is it necessary for people to be in a federal building to perform their work. What does that mean for people with disabilities? Well, first of all, they don't need to leave the support systems that they have within their local communities that they live in, whether it's a rural community, whether it's any part of the country that they live in. The dialogue has been, we're losing good possible workforce if we don't change our paradigm on how we recruit people, not just the new members to the workforce, but also existing workforce. Because opportunities are changing and people don't want to go back to what it was. So with that, I think people with disabilities are going to have a better chance, especially blind and low vision people, to apply for jobs at in the federal government because of this new mindset that the federal government is rolling out, where you don't have to relocate to DC, you don't have to locate to Maryland or Virginia or any of the big cities and leave your support system that you have with your families and other people in the community, which is pretty critical for the disability community to have those support systems. A lot of times we don't talk about that component. Transportation is a huge barrier, but leaving a support system is also another big barrier to move across the country. Now, I'm fortunate enough to do that and be able to function in the DC area. But it is good to know that there are other opportunities that's popping up. But we also need to be mindful when we're advocating for these remote work and telework, what that really means for people with disabilities. I know it's a huge value added for people with disabilities, but we all know one way of doing business does not fit everyone's personal needs. There are people with disabilities who would rather go into the office, who would rather be in that big city area and be in that federal space to do business. So when we advocate for telework, when we advocate for remote work, let's be mindful that that's not everyone's idea of what they want personally. And decades of work has been gone into this for creating accessible workspaces. We don't want all that to disappear. So when we have dialogues, when we have conversations about accessible workspaces in federal government or any other sectors, public or private sectors, we need to be mindful one size doesn't fit all. We need to be advocating for all accessible workspaces, whether it's remote or in person. And we don't want to forget best practices that we learned even in in-person workspaces, because that's something that has been put into play in decades of work. And the lessons we learned in the last year that can be accelerated to more accessible virtual workspaces. The technology space has significantly improved in the last year. In fact, you've seen a lot of growth because of the demand in virtual spaces. So the accessibility conversation has a long ways to go, but I'm excited to see the opportunities that's going to pop up in the federal workspace for people with disability.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Sachin. And what I'm hearing from the three of you is, a sense of momentum, a sense of hope, a paradigm shift in typical, closed-mindedness to the concept of virtual workforce. And I really appreciate what you just said, Sachin, is one size does not fit all. And so giving people the power of choice to determine where they can do and how they can do their best work. So thank you. So appreciate you also bringing up the technology piece, which is a big part of this conversation. So it's time to bring in Jennison. Jennison, you've been a trailblazer in this field, starting with the accessibility camps you began, did a lot of research. There's a lot of history about you out there. You joined forces in 2011 with Joe Devon and created the Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which now takes place on the third Thursday of May, a single day to think about, learn about, and experience global accessibility. So Jennison, how do we ensure that new workplace technologies are accessible and inclusive? And I've got a couple more questions for you, but please welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone from my dining room / remote office. I identify as he, him. I'm a Filipino, and so I have black hair and brown eyes. I'm wearing a white shirt. I want to talk about this from two perspectives, from the procurement side of the house, as well as from the in-house development of tools that employees would be using. Talking about first from the procurement side of things, just in the interest of full disclosure, in a previous life, I built the procurement process at one of Canada's largest banks. So this is the accessibility procurement process. So I have a lot to say on that, but I'm going to keep myself in bounds here. So we have time for everything. I think the most important thing to when you're purchasing is to probe. Ask questions. The more you ask questions to suppliers, the more that they understand that you are actually committed to accessibility. This isn't a checkbox exercise. So you might ask for a voluntary product accessibility template or a VPAT, some people might know, but that should be viewed as just one piece of things, of the data that you're going to be asking for. You need to ask all of your vendors, if you're going to be doing an RFP, things like, do they have their own internal accessibility capability? What does that look like? How does that vendor test for accessibility? Ask for customer references, just like you would for any other aspect of that product or feature. Asking for customer references is important, because then you can actually speak to them to say, so how accessible was the product really? Because when you first start talking to a vendor, you're typically talking to a salesperson, and the salespeople will let you hear everything you want. When you are evaluating contending products through an RFP or an RFI, you need to make accessibility one of the factors there. And from a strategic perspective, you need to look at building accessibility into the entire procurement process. And then, of course, the most important thing is the contract. And you need, if there is no language around accessibility in the contract, then you are you are basically going to be going on their goodwill. So there needs to be language in the contract talking specifically about how that vendor will address themselves to bugs, either known bugs that they're aware of, or bugs that come up as a result of you potentially using the product and your employees have come across a problem. My big piece of advice in this area is similar to security vulnerabilities or anything else. You as a company should not be paying for a supplier to close accessibility bugs. I have always, I've been doing this since 2006, but when I was building the procurement process, I made sure people understood that accessibility bugs are just like any other technical bug. And so why should I, as the person purchasing your tool, have to pay you to fix bugs that you created? So that's the kind of position and posturing with that. Just a few words on stuff that is developed in-house. That's a little bit easier. I'm not saying it's going to be like an end, like everything is going to work out necessarily immediately. But because if you're building it internally, you own the destiny of that product or that app, whatever you're building. So in that situation, you need to make sure that accessibility is built in from the beginning, and that starts at user requirements all the way to the pre-launch checklist. The other thing that's kind of important, it makes sense, but it's sometimes not done, is someone within that project needs to be held accountable as owner of accessibility. Because if you don't have that, and if you don't have mechanisms for tracking accessibility and what's happening within the project, it's more than likely going to be forgotten about. So if you are in a situation where you're building a product and you do not have someone who is tasked to own accessibility from the beginning to the end, that becomes problematic. Like I said, because of that of it potentially getting lost. The only other thing I'll talk about quickly is about testing. So of course, you're going to want to test with people with disabilities, but don't depend on just because you have employees with disabilities at your company, they're not your in-house QA. They're there to work. They've got a 9-to-5 job. You need to, if you really care about accessibility and you've built your own product internally, you're going to hire a QA team with people with disabilities, or you're going to pay for people with disabilities to test the product. Again, it's not the employees inside responsibility to be your testers. Similarly, you don't become the QA tester for an external vendor company either. That's their responsibility. And I'll stop there because I could go on and on.
Oh my gosh, you're incredible, Jennison. Thank you. Sure. So before I get to one of my last questions, I'd love to just kind of go back even to Keri and Sarah and just kind of reflect on everything the four of you have just shared. What I'm hearing from it really one person or a couple people within an organization can be the real difference makers. That it's people who are going to be the ones who determine the commitment in an organization to do all of this evaluation and discernment and prioritization and raising the flag to say this is important to us. Any comment or just reflection on, what that looks like? I mean, Keri, I know you as a consultant and Sarah too, when you go into organizations, can it just be one person that you partner with in an organization that can really, start the fire towards, more openness and more progressiveness, to inclusion and intersectionality? What does it really take to get the groundswell in an organization for all of this great work?
Well, this is Keri. I will definitely say we need everybody, right? Like everybody has to play their part, their position in order for us to see the type of momentum, the type of outcomes and impact that we genuinely need and deserve in the workplace. However, what I will say is having those key points of contact is critical. What we're seeing right now is that a lot of companies and organizations are making very public statements about their commitment to racial and disability equity, which is important. And so they're naming their expectations of how are we going to invest through advancement programs? How are we going to invest through our hiring practices? How are we going to contribute to tons of different groups and suppliers that are doing incredible things? And so there's this like action steps that are being named from leadership. And then what happens is that there's key folks that are saying, all right, let's figure out the how. Let's figure out who we need to be working with to ensure that we're actually executing on what we mean when we talk about inclusion, accessibility, and equity. So having those key points of contacts are critical, but in actuality, it takes community. It takes all different types of people from all levels to say, it doesn't matter what your position is. It doesn't matter how high you are in the company and the organization. Our united like attitudes, our united values, our united, the types of things that we put into our programs and our initiatives and our designs, that's what's really going to get us to this outcome of what we're looking for. So I think I would encourage folks to say that there has been investment in the disability community. There has been underinvestment in Black and Brown people with disabilities, but that can change. And that happens when we collectively say, what can I do? What can I give to be a part of this not a moment, but this movement that we're building to ensure that we're actually getting the outcomes that we need. So I would be on the lookout for who's in it. Right? Who's leading things, who's running programs and committees and all types of different things. And how can you join them in that effort? Because it's about everybody. It's about everybody being in to ensure we get that inclusion.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Keri, because I imagine there's many people on the call today who want to be part of the solution, but maybe aren't sure where to begin. And so what I'm hearing from you is look for the people who are leading the charge, even speaking up in meetings and voicing a concern about those who aren't being taken into consideration, whether it's consumers, whether it's customers, whether it's people inside the organization, and just show up and say, how can I help? So thank you. Sarah, I want to let you come back in and share your point of view.
Definitely. I want to echo a lot of what Keri said. And I think that, a lot of us, it needs a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach, right? It's not, as Keri said, it is a community effort. It's not enough for us just to be on the grassroots level, kind of really bringing forward that narrative. You do want that narrative then institutionalized into policies, right? But it's not enough for leaders just to bring forward policies and say, okay, look, we have these policies for inclusion, et cetera. And then people are the ones that implement the policy. So if people are not embodied and get trained and really believe in these policies, never going to be implemented in the right way. So I think that it needs kind of from both fronts. And also what ends up happening in a lot of different spaces is disability becomes siloed. Like there's an ERG for disability and then there we go. And we put all the problems on them. And we think that by having an ERG, we checked off the box, we are good, we are being inclusive, and there we go. Disability needs to be more mainstream throughout every single conversation, every single department, every single kind of entity, even across all types of ERGs, et cetera, right? So it needs to be kind of seen across all aspects within the company, not just from the policy side, from the program delivery side, from the implementation side, from all kinds of aspects. But I would say sometimes, we enter a company and we don't know where to start. And I think what Keri was saying is that we all have the power within us to empower someone else. We all have the power to kind of be part of the solution, right? We can see within our own ecosystem, in our own team, in our own space, whether, there's a way to kind of make sure every single person's voice is heard and they are part of kind of the space fully. And I always say the really important part to kind of bring forward, and something that was said earlier is, curiosity through the lens of compassion. Don't make any assumption of what that person needs or to be fully included. Really ask and have that space for them to kind of bring forward their own kind of experience and journey. So I think believing that all of us have the power within us to make a difference for in the space that we're in and to create an empowerment space for others. I think that allows us to really bring things forward. So, yeah.
Incredible. Ladies, wow. Thank you. So you already moved into what was going to be my final question. So I'm going to bring now Sachin and Jennison in, which was, if you were to put your career coach hat on, so many listeners, not only do we have organizations here listening and wanting to be inspired and getting that inspiration already, we're checking those boxes, it's happening. What about individuals who are on this call and want to be you, Keri? They want to be you, Sachin. They want to be you, Jennison, and you, Sarah. They are so inspired by what you are doing in this world, in this work. What is your career advice? What was the big difference maker for you in getting to where you are in your career? Jennison, I'll lob to you, my friend, first.
Sure. I grew up in a time when I was in high school, elementary, when there were certain perceptions of people who are blind were prevalent. And, there were certain job areas where I was told, oh, well, you're blind, you'd be best to do X, Y, and Z career. And as a teenager, I was certainly like, you're in a moldable state. So you're hearing that. And then on top of that, being an immigrant, there were also perceptions as to or expectations as to what I needed to be and do. So I say all of that, looking back on it now, to say you need to, as best as you can. And I know it's so easy for me to say, and it took a while for me to get through it. I had to go through my own journey, but you need to throw away other people's ideas of what you should be doing and really go with where your heart and where your passion is. And again, I know that's so easy to say, but I did a lot of different careers before I got to where I am now. And I look back and I value all of the experience I had, but ultimately where I am now, working in the accessibility space since 2006, I'm the happiest now that I have ever been in my career. But I know that I wouldn't have got here without having had those other experiences. So again, my big advice is don't listen to what other people are saying, even though they might be well-meaning professionals who might think that they know what you should be doing. But go with your passion, because that's ultimately when you wake up in the morning, you're going to be the one who's going to have to do that thing that we call work. And that takes up a lot of your week. So you need to love it and in order to really prevail in it and do all that kind of good stuff.
Incredible, Jennison. And you've got some major fandom going in chat. So bravo. Thank you. Sachin, what about you? What's your career advice for our listeners who want to be Sachin when they grow up?
I love what Jennison said. Don't just let people put you in a box where you're a blind person. This is what, these are the list of things you should be doing. Now, I think it's important to really step back and, be mindful of who you are as a person and explore what you can do as a person. It's good to get advices, but don't let those advices drive what you do in the future. Mentorship, role models all played a pretty big role in my life. As an immigrant, I didn't really know what kind of systems were available in this country. I wasn't really sure what opportunities I could pursue. But having those role models really did help me. Now, I didn't prescribe to everything they said. I took that and I ran with it. But one thing that really helped me is the whole idea of networking. Building relations and networking really made a huge difference in who I am and where I am right now. Now, people say, well, if you're going to be a networker, you need to be an extrovert. And I'm not an extrovert. I can perform as an extrovert when the need needs to be, but I'm usually fairly quiet and reserved in many settings, in social settings. But in a work setting, I can put that show on as far as networking, because I see the value. I see how it helps me. I've seen how it has helped me get me from where I was to where I am right now. So 100% what Jennison said, but also really embrace the value of building relations. You just don't know what that one relationship is going to help you in the next step in your career. Really expand on getting to know people, but don't do it just because you're trying to get something out of it. Be genuine when you're doing this networking. You can learn from professionals in the space, but you also can advance in your careers by networking.
Incredible. Thank you so much.
Can I just say plus 1,000 to what Sachin just said? I wouldn't be where I am without networking either. And that's such an important thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's a choice to show up, right? It's a choice for a lot of people to be here in their lunch hour or their afternoon hour. So just showing up and listening to these four incredible people today. Kudos to all of you in the audience. Keri, last question from me. We're going to transition to John Mackin at the 45-minute mark. There's amazing questions for him to field to all of you, but would love to know, just Sarah and Keri, a couple minutes from you both on what's been the real difference maker for you professionally that's gotten you to where you are today, please.
So this is Keri, and I love this question because I run so many programs for, young professionals. And I remember what it's like to be this like Black disabled girl from the South side of Longview, Texas. And I'm stepping into these workplaces and I'm just like, do I belong here? Is this me? Like all of these questions start going through your mind of like, I just don't know. And that was just exposure, right? Just like trying to figure out what this world even looks like and how I can be a part of it. One of the biggest things I want to encourage people is to be courageous about your career, be ambitious about it. There's been so many times in my life where I had no idea where I was going. No idea where I would end up, like just trying things, like try as many opportunities as possible, join committees, get involved in the community, meet people. All of that makes a big difference in terms of the clarity of who you are, what you can give, and where you're going with your life. I definitely want to co-sign the statements that were made earlier about networking. Over 80% of jobs are gained due to social capital. That means somebody recommended you, somebody forwarded a job opportunity to you. It is the people that you involve in your network that help you to build the opportunities out. So I just want to co-sign that and say, be courageous, be ambitious, try as many things as possible, and network for sure.
Beautiful. You were amazing. Thank you, Keri. And Sarah, what are your final thoughts on this matter?
Yeah, I mean, what everyone said is spot on. It's networking, not allowing society's perception to really impact your own perception of what you want to do in life, and ambition. I mean, so for me, I actually started my first venture when I was in college, Empowerment with Integration, that actually focused on the empowerment of blind and visually impaired youth and inclusion of them in developing countries. And I was able to kind of start the organization when I was young because I was able to take risks. When you're young, you take risks, right? And I remember going home and I told my parents, I'm no longer going to pursue, I was studying math and economics. I was like, I'm no longer going to pursue that in a PhD. I'm going to start a nonprofit. And they're like, what? You're going to start a nonprofit organization, But when you're young, you take risks. It's so important for us to take a step back, create that moment of pause and reflection, and really turn our own experiences into purpose of impact, because I believe that every single one of us in this world has something beautiful to contribute in society. And for me, starting ATI was from my own experience, realizing that I had the privilege of being empowered by my parents, but there's so many blind and visually impaired kids around the world that are marginalized because of the narratives in society, and they're not able to tap into their potential. So that in itself, that being able to take that risk and being able to be supported by my friends and family, I was able to kind of start that first venture. But one last kind of comment I wanted to make, and this is a advice from a professor I had. We all come with isms. I'm a blind Muslim woman. I come into a room, I face so many different narratives, whether it's towards ableism or Islamophobia or sexism, etc. And when you enter a room and you are embodying those isms, you start creating that vicious cycle of marginalization in some ways. But when you enter a room and you're embracing all of who you are and you say, I am proud of who I am, I'm proud of my disabilities, part of who I am, I belong here, and I have something valuable to contribute to this space, you start creating a powerful narrative of value. And I think for any of us, we are always dealing with these isms. So I think recognizing how can we move forward and really say, I belong here and I'm going to be contributing. And bringing that forward to your own work and your own purpose and what you want to do in this world is really important.
I can't tell you how inspired I am by all of your human spirits. Thank you so much for allowing me to enter this space and elevate and amplify all 4 of your amazing, amazing lives and professions. I'm going to transition now to the AFB PR leader, John Mackin, to field the final 15 minutes of questions. John?
Thank you, Katie, and big thank yous to all of the panelists. We have a lot of good questions here. Let's jump right in. Hello, is there a chance that there will be flatter and more learning organizations due to the pandemic? I am interested in women and employment and the pay gaps that have existed for women with disabilities. How do we get stereotypes of employers to lessen, which I am looking at in my doctoral program? Thank you. I think essentially, how do we reduce pay gaps? And will flatter learning organizations help to bridge this gap?
The first thing that I want to mention is that pay gaps are real. One of the things that we see is, if I think about the experiences of Black women, Black disabled women, we see that 80% of Black families, Black women are the breadwinners. However, they are one of the lowest paying demographics in our country. There's a lot of implications behind that and what that means for our community and what that means for the generations of our families to come. The issue that we're seeing is twofold. One, we need more data from companies that are coming out and documenting the disparities that are happening within their companies. Two, we need public accountability to state that if you are experiencing these pay gaps, then that means that there's something that needs to be adjusted, and very quickly, to ensure that people with disabilities, people of color are being paid in a proper and equitable way. That means activism at the intersection of organizational policies. The other thing that we're seeing is there needs to be more investment in the financial literacy of our communities. Oftentimes we see that people with disabilities, Black and Brown people with disabilities, are not taught what it means to negotiate, are not taught what it means to understand what your value is, and that's not a feeling, but that's like a very mathematical, factual situation. So there needs to be investment both in our people and our community to understand how much they are supposed to be earning, what their value is in the workplace, and that needs to be matched with what companies are offering to our individuals, and that accountability has to be built into our processes moving forward. So there's a lot of work definitely to be done there. I agree that programs are helpful with that, but accountability is, I would say, is one of the biggest things that we need.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add on to that as well? I mean, I'm not an expert in this as much as others are, but from own kind of personal experience, and also, one of the classes that we took in grad school was negotiations for specifically for women, right? And in general, there's, as Keri said, there is a pay gap, especially for women with disabilities, et cetera. And there's negotiation classes around how do we get women to really make sure, like when they get a job offer, they're trained to ask for a better, to negotiate for a better salary, because usually women don't do that as much as men. There's a lot of aspects around this, and I think there aren't enough curriculum and content out there and focus in terms of women with disabilities, because let's be real, some women with disabilities might feel like, oh my God, I'm getting an accommodation. That's okay. I'm so grateful I have a job and have the accommodation. I'm not going to ask for more. Right. And there's that sense of I'm already getting, asking for more. Right. So I think one of the side of the complex equation is how do we get women with disability to say, you're worth it. You're worth it, and accommodation is not an extra, and that you should be asking for what your worth is.
Thank you so much, Keri and Sarah. If no one else has an answer, I'll jump into the next question. Okay. How do you address so-called diversity initiatives and businesses that do not include and indeed exclude people with disabilities? Most EDI activities are exclusive of people who are deaf or disabled.
This is Sachin. I'll jump in real quick. This is an ongoing problem when we have a conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Often disability is not included in that conversation, and this happens in every sector. There's higher education, federal, private, no matter which sector you work for. People with disabilities are part of the diverse population that we live in, the diverse community that we live in. Companies and organizations really need to understand the intersection of all the underlying factors that we people with disabilities. Now, I'm a blind person, but I'm not just a blind person. I'm a blind person who is an immigrant, a person of color. There's all these different aspects. There's areas that I bring to the table and can add to the conversation. So organizations, when they start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, since that is a topic that's being discussed broadly in all these different entities, we need to really understand which part of the community has been left out, which we all know disability community is the one that's often left out. So I strongly encourage that organizations seriously take into consideration, seriously really understand the disability community as what are the factors that they bring to the table and what they can add to the conversation.
I'll just add something really quickly. I think definitely in agreement with what Sachin said, but I think we as people with disabilities also play a part. And the comment was brought up about the employee resource groups. That there's ones that are specifically for people with disabilities and their allies. But those of us with disabilities and impairments also need to be part of those other employee resource groups or other support systems to bring that point home. Exactly. So if there is, if you do share an affinity with another employee resource group or other such support group in a workplace, consider just joining that as well. And because without us being in those other affinity groups and such, the issue just might get acknowledged but not really talked about. But we need to actually show up, as the term is always being used these days. We need to show up in those other groups too to say, hey, I might happen to have a disability or impairment, but hey, I also am I'm also an immigrant or an Asian American or whatnot. So we have a role to play. We as people with disabilities have a role to play as well.
And then I want to add on to all of this. I mean, this is amazing. And one other thing as well in the diversity and inclusion world, even if they do have a disability kind of sector, ERG or whatever it is, there's disability so diverse, right? And you have visible and invisible disability. And I think one of the really conversations are always missing is, when we do a lot of our trainings, we actually have a lot of people come up and say, I have an invisible disability. I'm not comfortable talking about this or bringing this forward because of, the stigma. And when you have an invisible disability, you have kind of, it's tough in the sense like you have to choose when to disclose and how to disclose and whether you want to disclose or not and all this kind of stuff. And it's not discussed and it's not part of a lot of these conversation, mental health and other kinds of invisible disabilities. So it's almost like companies usually, again, they use it as a check. Okay, great. We have a disability RG, great. And then they have token employees sometimes with disabilities and there we go. But we're diverse of so many different types of disabilities and there's a lot invisible, not just visible disabilities. So there's a lot of, complexities to how companies are addressing disability inclusion or are not addressing disability inclusion.
And this is Carrie. Just one more thing I'll add to that is like, we could really use everyone in the audience and even more people's help with the exposure, right? Because what was to the last point that was just made is that there is so much stigma when it comes to the disability identity that still exists. Just the word disability in a lot of places is really hard to receive. And we need people's support to apply that pressure and let people know that our existence is here, it is valuable, and it has to be a part of the momentum of DEI overall. So like our collective efforts in terms of getting that exposure, in terms of destigmatizing our community is incredibly necessary. And also the other thing that I will add is that there's a lot of DEI apartments that are holding like all of the diverse demographics, right? So you'll have representatives within an organization or a company, and they're holding the LGBTQ portfolio, they're holding the, certain racial and ethnic group portfolio, they're holding the disability community portfolio. And not only is that a lot to hold, but they end up prioritizing who they can actually access. And so that is something that we need to address, but also it's a situation where how do we jump into the faces of folks and say, you got to put us on the plate. You have to make sure that we are included because we are 1/5 of the population, at least in the United States. And everything that we're doing is intersected in all of your portfolios collectively. So I agree with the question and everything that folks have said. And I want to say we really need to increase the exposure of our community.
Thank you all. This is great. We're rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to jump into as many questions as we can in our final remaining moments. What's number one on your wish list for making workplaces accessible? What's your moonshot wish?
I mean, I think for me, this is a very vague answer, but just to keep it short, I don't want companies to be looking at disability, the inclusion from a technical lens. I want them to be looking at it from an adaptive lens. How do you really dig to the core aspect of why are we not including people with disability fully and understand the core aspects of the narrative and how do we shift that holistically? If we look at it from the problem from a technical lens, then we're going to approach it with technical solutions, which will never sustain, we'll never have a sustainable solution towards disability inclusion.
This is Jennison. I'll just say with something that is being talked about broadly, forget disability or not, but Moonshot would be for companies to really embrace the reality of hybrid and or fully remote work, particularly for people with disabilities, for the reasons we've talked about. One thing we haven't really talked about is transportation, but that is really an issue that does pose a barrier for many people with different disabilities or impairments. So by embracing hybrid and fully remote, we can deal with that issue in particular.
This is Keri. That's a tough one because I have a list. But what I will say is the future of disability rights is intersectional. And so I say that because I think it's very important for us to center the experiences of Black and Brown people with disabilities in our journey of accessibility and inclusion. And I say that because when we center the experiences of those most impacted, then it leaves space for everyone to benefit from that, to be establishing standards where everyone is included and has their thoughts and ideas. And that has not traditionally happened. Centered those who are most privileged within the disability experience and in society at large. And so we need to go back and make sure that we are looking at accessibility and inclusion from the experiences of those most impacted, which definitely includes Black and Brown people with disabilities.
This is Sachin. I'll just add, it's a hard one to respond because, like Keri said, I have a list of a wish list, I guess. One thing I would add is when we talk about inclusion and accessibility, especially accessibility, a lot of time the focus is on affluent communities, your big cities, the areas that most people, the densely populated people live. Well, a lot of US is not affluent, and you have rural communities. You have communities that are out there that people would love to reside and live in, and what people with disabilities don't have that kind of options and be successful professionally. So when we talk accessibility, when we talk inclusion, are we talking about why are we not talking about the region as a whole? Why we focus on very particular focus area? Let's talk about inclusion and accessibility in the region as a whole. Just don't focus on small sectors.
Well, I would like to thank you all for having such thoughtful answers. At this point, we are out of time. I want to thank you all again, and I just want to let our audience know that lots and lots of great questions we were not able to get to. We will put a blog post on our website that we will try to tackle all of these questions to the best of our ability. And I just want to thank everyone again.
A logo, AFB 100. Inclusion knows no limits. Closing text. American Foundation for the Blind would like to thank our Centennial sponsors for their generous support. Diamond sponsors: Google, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Horizon Therapeutics, JP Morgan Chase & Company, and Encore. Platinum sponsors: American Printing House, Exelon, Facebook, LHH, Opportunity Delivered, Northrop Grumman, Pepco and Exelon Company, U.S. Bank, Vanda Pharmaceuticals Incorporated, and Walmart. Gold sponsors: Microsoft and Verizon. Silver sponsors: Charter Communications, Challenger Gray and Christmas Incorporated, Guiding Change, Getting Results, and IBM. Exhibitors: NLS, the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled, Library of Congress, Spark Therapeutics, TrackPhone Wireless Incorporated, and Willis Towers Watson. Additional supporters: CTIA, New York Life, 175 years, and the Lighthouse for the Blind Incorporated. American Sign Language interpreters: Monique Funches and Yesenia Dobbins. Audio description narrator: Amuche Chukwudebelu. Captions produced by White Coat Captioning. This virtual event was produced by Bridge Multimedia, empowering accessibility. Tommy Camisa, Derek Garcia, John Finnan, Matt Kaplowitz, Louis Malissi, and Manny Manaya.